It is Thanksgiving week, and it is the Pro Football Focus Chalk Talk podcast. With me as the host and the wonderful Tyler Buecher as co-host. Before we dive right into the Thursday games and accompanying analysis, I wanted to pat myself and Tyler on the back a little bit, as I'm apt to do. Last week we highlighted all of Latavius Murray, Brandon Cooks, Keenan Allen, LaShawn McCoy, Blaine Gabbert, Larry Fitzgerald, Jarvis Landry, Marvin Jones, etc., etc. And we had a super successful week. Both of us, I 10x'd on FanDuel after 20xing the week previous. Really a huge week for myself, but also the podcast, and maybe more so for the podcast. A bunch of listeners reached out to me, tweeting me with their awesome winning lineups, and I'm guessing a lot of them, maybe could have been actually more successful than me, because I was on Latavius. Tyler talked me off. I was on LaShawn McCoy. Tyler talked me off. Tyler was on DeAndre Hopkins. I talked him off. So maybe, if you're a listener, combine the sum of our parts to make something greater than ourselves, because we were a little too combative last week. Tyler, what's going on? Do you have anything to add here to our successful Week 11?
Latavius Murray, dude. I was so quick to shoot him down just because of the timeshare that they're in. But I have to admit, you inceptioned me, where you planted the idea of Latavius back in the tiniest crevice of my mind. And as the week progressed, it just kept growing and growing until by Sunday morning, I found myself with every single entry GPP that I entered had Latavius in its stead. By the time 12 o'clock rolled around, I'm like, what am I doing? I can't play Latavius. I've got way too much money at stake here. And I pulled out. I withdrew every single entry with Latavius, swapped over to Melvin Gordon. It was an okay play. But the gigantic price jump that it led me to took me off Brandon Cooks, took me off Travis Kelce, guys that all smashed. It was probably a 70-point swing between the three players I swapped out of, and I could have 10x'd as well if I had stuck to my guns. I'm hoping for the 10x Week 12. That's all I'll say.
That's brutal. I ended up with 0 Latavius as well. But that's okay. You've made me some money, getting me off of some bad calls in recent weeks. So I guess we're even now. Guys, it's the Thanksgiving slate. It's a little disappointing to know that Calvin Johnson is still retired. He had, in his last 7 Thanksgiving games, 3 touchdowns, 2 touchdowns, 1 touchdown, 1 touchdown, 1 touchdown, 1 touchdown, 1 touchdown, as well as 3 100-yard games over that stretch. Unfortunately, he's not going to be playing, but maybe we can uncover the next Calvin Johnson, or this week's Calvin Johnson. Let's start off with that Detroit Lions game being played at home against the Vikings at 12:30 Eastern Time. Tyler, Matthew Stafford's been a QB1 in 5 straight games. Are you excited about his fantasy potential this week?
Yeah, this is an interesting first game we have here. It started out with the Lions as a 1-point home favorite. The line has moved 4 points towards the Vikings. It's going to be a tough matchup here for Stafford. The Vikings defense has been incredible lately. Xavier Rhodes is shutting down wide receivers left and right. They've got a pretty solid front four, strong linebacking core. It's going to be a tough one. Not a lot of teams have fared well against the Vikings when it comes to the pass. To be honest, I'm not sure where I place Matthew Stafford. I think he might be one of the top 3, maybe top 4 quarterbacks on the slate. Where do you find him within your rankings?
Well, if you don't like Matthew Stafford, what about Amir Abdullah? Though his recent volume has been declining, looking at expected fantasy points over the past 4 weeks, he's still one of the top values on DraftKings at least. Still, I can't get on board with it. The Vikings are the best defense against expectation to opposing running backs this season. Theo Riddick saw a season-high 9 carries last week, but I don't think he's a strong play either. Are you targeting either of those guys?
No, I'm not going to target either of them. Abdullah scored a touchdown in 3 straight games, and yet his fantasy point totals from that are 11.5, 12.5, 11.7. If it weren't for those touchdowns, those would just be 6-point outings from him. So he needs a touchdown or bust for him to pay off any kind of dividend here. And this is a slate where I think we're going to need 12 plus, 15 plus maybe fantasy points from our running backs. And there's 4 to 5 guys I really like here at the running back position. Abdullah is just not one of them. Neither is Theo Riddick. His role has declined massively since the end of 2016. And this Vikings defense, they're very good at defending opposing running backs. I don't think he's going to have a lot of room to run or catch. What do you think about the wide receiver position, though? We've got Marvin Jones coming off a string of great games. Golden Tate, PPR magnet, great targets. What do you think about them against this Viking secondary?
So yeah, Marvin Jones has been hyper productive and has seen an immense usage as of late. And unfortunately, he draws one of the best cornerbacks in the league in Xavier Rhodes. I have to mention that Jones actually ranks top 3 among all wide receivers in percentage of routes lined up against top 25 graded cornerbacks. So he has had a tough cornerback schedule and has risen above it, but I don't see him doing that this week against Xavier Rhodes, who over his career has seen 8 targets against Xavier Rhodes, yet has totaled just 16 yards on those targets. Golden Tate has a slightly better matchup, but it's still tough. Minnesota ranks 21st in fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. TJ Jones and Kenny Galladay have the better matchup against Trey Waynes, though he has been better of late, and both are stuck in a committee. I could see maybe 5%, 7% exposure on Kenny Galladay. What do you think about that?
I like it. I just think Galladay's ceiling is probably 5 targets. As much as we want to call him Babytron, he's not going to see a Megatron-esque stat line here on Thanksgiving. I think the play, if you're looking for a Lions guy, is probably going to be Golden Tate in the slot. Terrence Newman, Mackenzie Alexander, they're both kind of swapping in there in the slot. They're both exploitable. I mean, it's not a must-fade matchup here. And if we think the Vikings are going to score like I do, I think we kind of want to bring it back with a little bit of Lions. And the one guy I would probably play here is Tate, if anyone. Tight end position, any interest in Eric Ebron? Do you want to try to chase that?
He did see a season-high 7 targets last week, but Minnesota's also been one of the best defenses against tight ends, and he's been extremely inconsistent this season. He's not someone I'm really looking at. So let's move on to the other side, which kind of looks a little bit better. Case Keenum, believe it or not, ranks 6th in fantasy points per game among quarterbacks over the past 4 weeks, and he's coming off of an especially difficult matchup last week, and this is a fairly average matchup for him. Are you excited about Keenum this week?
No and yes. I mean, like, the thing with Keenum is his weapons are in such a great spot. Like, that's the reason why you like Keenum. He's also thrown the ball, I think, 30 plus times in 4 of his last 5 games. At least 40 attempts it was against the Browns. This is the type of defense where their pass rush isn't incredible. I think they rank towards the middle of the pack as far as pressures, but their sacks are a little lackluster. I don't know, man. Keenum, so on DraftKings, he's 5,300. He's the second cheapest behind only Eli Manning. So there is some appeal there. I don't like to play any cash games on these 3-game slates. Should mention that at the beginning of the show. I think we're going to speak here mostly for GPPs. And that being said, Keenum's a guy who has, I don't know, maybe an 15-point floor in this matchup. And his ceiling, though, could range anywhere from 30 points to maybe 20 tops. He's just got such a wide range of outcomes, which makes him a great GPP play, but I think I'd rather go for a guy I know has a more narrow possibility of where he could put up points and go for a guy like Keenum. I'll be targeting a lot of his receivers and other targets, but Keenum by himself, I don't know. Can you sell me on him? Because I'm honestly not that sold on him.
So I think the reason to play him is he has been successful recently, but also because you can stack him with those receivers that you said you do like. I like Adam Thielen quite a bit. He ranks top 6 among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game, top 3 in actual fantasy points per game. Exploded last week. We didn't talk about him because that did look like a tough matchup on paper. The Rams slot cornerback Nickel Roby Coleman did suffer an injury and played only 9 snaps, which made the matchup a little bit better. But still, he's just been hyper productive and consistent of late, out targeting Stephon Diggs. He draws Quandre Diggs this season, who has been better than he was last year. But Detroit's still allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers, and he will avoid Darius Slay, while Stephon Diggs will not. Though Diggs went for 98 yards in Week 4 against Detroit, Thielen was a little less successful, going for 59 yards. Diggs has run a career 22 routes against Slay, totaling just 3 catches for 33 yards and 5 targets. Slay is one of the top, 6 shadow cornerbacks to me, and I'm going to be avoiding him this week in favor of Thielen.
Yeah, I agree with you there. The matchup with here, Thielen running most of his routes out of the slot is exactly what we want to target, mainly because he's avoiding Slay, but also just as equally important, he's running against Quandre Diggs. Diggs has allowed a 123.3 passer rating when targeted against in the slot. That's the 3rd highest rate among all slot cornerbacks. Thielen has seen 98 yards, 166, and 123 over his last 3 games. He leads the team in both red zone targets and targets inside the 10-yard line. Keenum really has eyes for him, and I think he's going to be in a great spot here. I think he'll be the most heavily owned wide receiver of the slate.
Kyle Rudolph is also interesting to me. He's had 7 or 9 targets in 6 straight games since Dalvin Cook's injury. I think he's due for some positive regression in that regard because production has not been great. And Detroit's giving up the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends over expectation this season. Any interest in Rudolph? I know there are specifically 2 tight ends to like even more, but he is interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's worth a sprinkle in if you're going for some kind of mass multi-entry, even just like if you're trying to hit the 20 max that DraftKings offers. There's at least some merit to considering Rudolph. The Lions are allowing the 5th most receiving yards to the position, and he's just a different way to create a unique lineup in a week where you're going to need to find some ways to differentiate yourself. As far as Diggs, though, I wanted to circle back on Stephon Diggs a little bit. So he hasn't been playing well. He hasn't been seeing a ton of targets, but he has the capability of going nuclear anytime he touches the ball. It's a very, very tough matchup here, as you mentioned, against Darius Slay, but I think it's worth mixing in some Diggs due to his potential. He's topped 8 targets just once all year, but it's that big play potential that Diggs has. If he were able to shake Slay or find himself lined up in the slot, Diggs runs some routes there as well. It's not solely just Thielen running out of the slot. I think Diggs could be a sneaky way to gain some exposure to this game.
I don't know, man. Week 8, Darius Slay shadowed Antonio Brown on 77.4% of his routes, held him to just 1 catch and 9 yards. Week 6, shadowed Michael Thomas on 71.4% of his routes, held him to just 1 catch for 4 yards. I don't think Diggs is of the same caliber as those guys, although he's honestly probably close. But I'm buying more into Slay's talent than I am Diggs' talent and volume, I guess. So I'm going to be avoiding him. Do understand your argument, though. What about the running backs? Because I like Latavius and I like Jerick McKinnon in this matchup, but I think this debate goes back to exactly where we were last week. The matchup's not as good, but it does favor one running back in particular. In terms of expected fantasy points, since Dalvin Cook went down with an injury, these guys are near even, just about RB18 if looking over the course of a full season. McKinnon's definitely the better player. He's a better player in full point PPR than half point PPR. Murray does have more touchdown upside. The matchup is good for both. Detroit ranks 6th worst against expectation to opposing running backs over the last 5 weeks, but they're a little worse on the ground. Detroit's giving up the 4th most rushing fantasy points per game and the 13th most receiving fantasy points per game. So that has me leaning Latavius a little bit, especially because I think he's going to come in much lower owned. Where do you stand on this, Tyler?
So McKinnon is a guy that I'm super into this week. In fact, he's my number 2 overall running back on the slate if I had to grade them all. Latavius, he's down there at number 5. That said, I don't think there's very much of a difference between 2 through 5 for me here. I think they all have a lot of similar upside, and honestly, the upside's not massive. I mean, we only have a couple games to work with here, and I don't think there's a lot of difference between the floors and ceilings here of any of these running backs. So I'm going to try to mix in a ton of them. I'm going to have a strong core of wide receivers I want, and tight ends and quarterbacks, and I'm just going to be mixing in the running backs. That's how I'm probably going to attack the slate. McKinnon, I think, is the ideal GPP play for this slate, though. He scored 25-plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 5 games. The Lions are allowing the 6th most receptions to opposing running backs, which spells a really good outing for McKinnon. He's got 19 targets over his last 3 games, while consistently getting double-digit carries. I understand the argument for Murray as well. I think he's a pretty good play here. Detroit is tied for the 6th most red zone trips allowed per game. They're also allowing the 8th highest touchdown percentage to said red zone trips. So that means like when opposing offenses are getting down, they're converting a lot of those opportunities into scores. Minnesota is rushing on 51.1% of the red zone plays. That's the 8th most in the league. And Latavius is out rushing McKinnon from the 20 to 12, from inside the 10, 9 to 5, and inside the 5-yard line, 7 to 2. So Murray's out touching him on the ground rushing in every step of the way as they get closer to the goal line. So that's the only real appeal for me, is if Latavius is able to punch us in for a score. And that's what we really want on a small slate, are guys with touchdown equity. Latavius has it.
Well said, though I'm not sure that gives us much clarity.
Fair. It doesn't give much clarity. I think they're both in play, because it's the truth.
So you have McKinnon as your number 2 running back. I don't have him inside my top 3. Who I do have inside my top 3, Alfred Morris. He's averaging 6.2 yards per carry. He gets Tyron Smith back. He just totaled 91 rushing yards in the single worst matchup for any running back on the ground against Philadelphia, and that was without Tyron Smith. Now he draws the Los Angeles Chargers, who rank 2nd worst in yards per carry allowed. Again, he's had a blowout in 2 straight weeks, so I don't think people are going to be thinking about him too much, but I see this as a smash spot for him, and he is probably going to be one of my most owned running backs. It's a debate between him and Samaje Perine, which we will have, but I'm all aboard Alf Morris. He's not in your top 2 or he's not in your top 2. Where does he rank?
Number 3, he's right there with McKinnon. Like I said, they're all very closely ranked. They're all very close in price. They're all very close in potential ceiling here. I don't have anything negative to say against Morris. I think he's in a great spot here, too, against the Chargers. They're allowing 4.7 yards per carry to opposing running backs. He's a great play. Are you worried about Rod Smith at all? He didn't do much last week. I know a lot of people were interested in him as a contrarian way for the Cowboys to get some yardage against the Eagles, was through the air throwing to Rod Smith. Rod Smith didn't do anything. It was the Alf show. And do you have any interest in Rod, though, going into Week 12?
If you're a receiving back and you see 0 targets in a 9-37 beatdown, I don't see why you'd play him here.
Thank you for taking the layup. Okay, excellent. I wanted 0 Rod Smith as well.
That was kind of a sloppy segue by me, but yes, now we're talking about Dallas at home against Los Angeles. It's at 4:30 Eastern Time. We just discussed the running backs. What about Dak Prescott? Any interest in him? He's been abysmal since losing Ezekiel Elliott and Tyron Smith. Should we trust him?
I don't think there's any reason to doubt him. I just don't think there's any reason to play him when you have a guy like Kirk Cousins on the slate, who has probably the highest floor and the highest ceiling of all quarterbacks. I'm not really going to be playing any Dak, to be honest. I like that Tyron Smith's back. His poor performances over the last couple weeks should have lower ownership. I'm going to keep a very tight core of players, and Dak will not be in it. Are you into Dak?
A little bit, not really. Like you said, Kirk Cousins stands out this week, and we know that quarterbacks typically don't draw as high of an ownership as you might expect in DFS tournaments. So he's he's definitely the guy who stands out to me, and we'll talk about another one a little bit later who I like. What about his running back? What about his wide receivers? Des Bryant seeing a wide receiver one workload, he's not really performing as well as we might expect. He's actually the least efficient player in all of football in terms of expected fantasy points per game versus actual fantasy points per game. And we've talked about many times on the show before how he's one of the more cornerback sensitive wide receivers in the league. And that's especially rough for him this week, drawing shadow coverage against Casey Hayward, who is now our number one graded cornerback this season. He shadowed Demaryius Thomas on 84% of his routes in week 7, held him to 0 yards. Shadowed Amari Cooper in week 6, held him to 7 yards. Shadowed Alshon Jeffrey in week 4, held him to 13 yards. So I do not see Des Bryant having a productive day, and he is a fade for me. What about for you, Tyler?
Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. On these small slates, sometimes you need to make a stand, and mine is going to be to completely fade Des Bryant here. He's got a very tough matchup here against Casey Hayward, who, like you mentioned, was our number one graded cornerback on the year. He's allowing just a 56.7 QB rating when targeted against. Des hasn't been really doing that well either for most of the season. He's got a very low average depth of target, low yak. He has yet to post a 100-yard receiving game yet this year. There's just not a lot of upside here for Des, who's got a very tough opponent and just a very limited ceiling in a week where you need a ceiling in order to take home a GPP. So we're both going to fade Des. Are there any Dallas Cowboys that pique your interest? Terrence Williams, Cole Beasley, anyone there really make you want to play with them this week?
Cole Beasley has the matchup in his favor. The Chargers are allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers, but he's not someone I can get on board with. 7 yards last week, 23 yards before that, 24 before that, 8 before that, 24, 23, 17, 4. He did have two touchdown games this season, but outside of that, he's just been completely useless for fantasy. Yeah, I'm not really on Terrence Williams either. 35 yards last week, 9 before that. He did have that big 141-yard game, but everything since week 2 has been under 50 yards, 0 touchdowns for the year. Not too excited about him, and I'm especially not excited about Jason Witten up against a Los Angeles Chargers defense that ranks best in the league. 2 opposing tight ends in fantasy points per game over expectation. Do you agree, Tyler?
Couldn't agree anymore. I want 0% exposure to Jason Witten this week. Let's move over to the Chargers side of the ball. Phillip Rivers. I'm very into Phillip Rivers this week. I think you are as well. This is the game that we kind of want to target from a general DFS perspective. It's the highest score in the game at 48 points. If neither of us are that into many Dallas Cowboys aside from Alf, are we expecting a pretty big passing outcome here from the Chargers?
Yeah, I'm on Rivers to a degree. He's not my top guy. And I think you'd have to feel really good about Keenan Allen's matchup to play him or be a little bearish on Melvin Gordon, which I know you are, but I'm a little bit more optimistic about Gordon's prospects this week. He still played 100% of the snaps in the first half of last week's game. Eckler came in, but it was a complete and total blowout. And I think the matchup's excellent because, and I know it's a small sample size, it's only 3 games, but Dallas is allowing 32.3 fantasy points per game to running backs without Lee, as opposed to 21.2 with him in the lineup. I see this as being more of a game where you want to chase the running back. Granted, he will see high ownership. Tyler, you're attacking this game somewhat differently. What are you doing?
Yeah, I'm going with another full fade here on Melvin Gordon. He's priced 8,100 on DraftKings. That's almost $3K more than the next highest priced running back, Jerick McKinnon at 5,200. The problem here is Melvin Gordon hasn't really displayed that ceiling that we wanted coming into the year over the last couple weeks. Over the last 4 outings, he's put up 14, 9.2, 23.9, and 5.4 fantasy points. If we were to get a 5.4 outing from him at 8.1K, he's going to bury some lineups. So I'll take that 3K savings and try to grab any other running back who is putting up a similar kind of stat line. We've got a lot of bruisers on this slate. We've got Samaje Perine, Alfred Morris, Latavius Murray, Melvin Gordon. Not a lot of these guys have reception upside. Gordon's receiving upside has kind of disappeared over the last couple of weeks. Gordon hasn't had more than 2 targets in a game over the last 3 weeks. I mean, if Gordon were to put up, I don't know, say 10 to 12 fantasy points, I think you could easily get that kind of performance from Samaje Perine or Alf at a fraction of the cost. And I don't know, I think it's a bit of a contrarian way just to create a more cap space for you to pay up at wide receiver or tight end if you were to fade Melvin Gordon. I know it's a risky move, but I mean, if you want to win a tournament, sometimes you're going to have to make comfortable decisions.
Yeah, there's definitely some risk there for sure. Eckler has outscored Gordon by 19.5 fantasy points the last 2 weeks, despite seeing 19 fewer opportunities. Maybe they get him more involved because he's played so well. Still, I'm a believer in Gordon. His usage, his production has dipped, but he was coming into week 8 with a fairly serious injury. In week 10, they were on bye in week 9. Week 10, he did see 16 carries and 5 targets. And then last week, the team was up by 30 points at the half, so I can see how he didn't see much usage in the second half. It's a debate for sure, and like you said, he's extremely expensive, and he's going to be highly owned. What about Keenan Allen, who I suspect to be highly owned as well?
Yeah, I kind of like this matchup here against Orlando Scandrick. It's not one that we're normally running to, but the one against Scandrick is kind of beatable. He's allowing a 63.8% catch rate on the season. He's allowed 2 touchdowns credited against him. Allen has some really wild splits whenever he sees 10 targets or more. That raises his fantasy output from 10.3 fantasy points per game in games with fewer than 10 targets up to 22.7 fantasy points per game anytime he sees double-digit targets. I think this is one of those games where we could see the Chargers throwing a ton. Opponents are passing against Dallas 60.1% of the time. That's the 6th highest rate in the league. It's allowed them to rack up a ton of receiving stats against them. They just allowed opposing slot receivers like Larry Fitzgerald to go for 13, 149 and 1. Jamison Crowder went for 9, 123 and 0. The ceiling's there. It's just 7,300 is a lot to pay for Keenan Allen. He's coming off a monster outing. I kind of really think Keenan Allen will be a part of my core going into Thursday.
I'm okay with that. What about Mike Williams? You saw a season-high 8 targets last week. Travis Benjamin is questionable. Maybe that puts Tyrell Williams in play as a low percentage guy. But what about Mike Williams? I think I like Mike Williams a lot.
Yeah, 3.1K on DraftKings. He's seen increasing snaps over the past 5 weeks, culminating in 8 targets last week. He's becoming an integral part of this offense. I kind of like him as an interesting punt play if you're trying to differentiate lineups.
And what about the tight end, Hunter Henry? Ertz disappointed last week against Dallas, but I'm not sure if he was 100%. He gave up big games to Kelsey and Hooper the 2 weeks before that. They don't look great in terms of fantasy production allowed, but they've also had one of the easier tight end schedules of the year, and were bottom 3 last year. Like we said, Sean Lee is out. Are you on Henry, or has his usage been too inconsistent for you?
Yeah, so like you mentioned with Lee being out of the lineup, it's been really detrimental to their pass defense against opposing tight ends. Over the last 3 of the 4 last games they've played without Sean Lee, they've allowed receiving stat lines of 455 and 0, 593 and 0, and 759 and 1 to opposing tight ends. The Cowboys allow the 6th most red zone trips to opposing offenses, so the touchdown potential is there for Hunter Henry. The problem is we're seeing Mike Williams now with these 8 targets. He's taking over that role that Hunter Henry once held. Henry's been very quiet the last 3 weeks. I think he's one of those tight end plays where If you want to go double tight end, maybe you go Hunter Henry here and Vernon Davis and double stack the tight end position. I don't know. What do you think about Hunter Henry this week?
I don't know if I like him as much as Kyle Rudolph, which means I definitely don't like him as much as the next two tight ends we'll get to.
I think that's fair. Henry's like a 10 to 15% play for me, I think.
You want to move on to the next game, which is Washington at home against the Giants, favored by 7 at 8:30 Eastern time.
Yeah, this is a really great game. This is going to be the one that I'm going to have potential onslaughts here. I mentioned it in my PFF article earlier this week. On short slates, sometimes it's a really smart move to just load up on a team in anticipation of a shootout and just hope they go nuclear. I'm expecting that to be Washington on the slate. They're at home, 7.5-point home favorites. The Giants are allowing the 4th most passing yards, 3rd most rushing yards. They're allowing the 5th most red zone trips to opposing offenses. And the Giants really aren't that motivated here playing for Ben McAdoo. I could see Washington run away with this game. What do you think of this as a whole? I just listed a bunch of reasons why I like the Washington team as a whole. Do you want to dive into the individual players here? Kirk Cousins, 7,100, the top priced quarterback of the week. What do you think of him here?
Yeah, he definitely is my top quarterback, even though he is the most expensive. Redskins have the highest implied point total of the week. Giants rank 5th worst in fantasy points per game over expectation to opposing quarterbacks the last 5 weeks. Granted, Cousins will be without their starting center. He has Brandon Scherf, 3 tackles, banged up. But luckily for him, the Giants rank last in sacks and last in pressures per dropback. Cousins, meanwhile, ranks 2nd among all quarterbacks in fantasy points per game since week 3. He's playing fantastic. The Giants will be without linebackers B.J. Goodson, Calvin Munson, Jonathan Casillas, which bodes well for their slot receivers and their tight ends, which have been Cousins' 2 most consistent receivers of late. Yeah, he's my top quarterback for sure, and I know you feel the same way.
Yeah, big time. Plus, you never know when Ben McAdoo might hand out one of his sporadic, arbitrary one-game suspensions. I mean, we could see Janoris Jenkins benched for no reason because he talked up during practice on Wednesday.
Not something I want to bank on, but who knows with this Giants team that has definitely fallen apart lately. They did squeak out an upset win last week, but they did have a significant home field advantage with the wind and the Meadowlands, which Eli Manning has played with throughout the entirety of his career. The old Giants stadium being easily the windiest stadium in all of football. Samaje Perine, I don't really think there needs to be too much said, but he's my top value running back far and away. He's in my top 3 alongside Alfred Morris, ahead of Alfred Morris, and probably ahead of Melvin Gordon as well. Just with all the injuries, losing Chris Thompson, losing Rob Kelly, I don't see how he's not used as the team's workhorse, and this is a matchup for him to exploit. Tyler, what do you think?
Not much to add there. He should get 20 touches here without much competition. The team added Byron Marshall. He just had 3 snaps last week. I think he's rather insignificant. I won't be throwing any darts at Marshall. I think it's just Pirine here. Play it simple. Go for the volume. Wide receiver position. Okay. I'm having some trouble differentiating between Jamison Crowder. He's seen 8+ targets in 3 straight. Or Josh Doxson, who has that high upside touchdown, big play capability. Can you pick one for me? I'm struggling here, Scott. I need some help.
Yeah, so the Giants are definitely getting gashed by receivers lately. They actually rank worst against expectation the last 5 games. Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie has been great in the slot, but Crowder legitimately still has one of the best matchups of the slate. Like I said, the Giants linebackers have been bad for a long period of time, and now and there's a lot of injuries there. He has 6, 13, 11, 8 targets the last 4 weeks. Ryan Grant's going to get a similar matchup. And Josh Doxson actually ran more routes than either of them last week. He saw 7 targets last week. Grant saw 3. I can get how this one's tricky, but I think I'm going to attack Crowder over the middle of the field where the Giants are most vulnerable.
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning that way too. That guaranteed 8+ targets looks pretty good. Plus, without Chris Thompson in the fold, I think Crowder could see a lot of those shorter targets as well. Let's move over to the tight end position. Vernon Davis. I don't think there's much more to say. He's really been carving out a massive role here over the past few weeks. Target totals of 9, 11, and 6 over his last 3 games. The Giants have allowed either a touchdown or 100 yards receiving to a tight end in every game. I think he should be the focal of the intermediate passing game here for Cousins, and Cousins to Vernon Davis is probably my number 1 stacking option of the week.
Yeah, it's absolutely a layup spot. You're going to be attacking the Giants where they're most susceptible. Their linebackers, which are also banged up, but they've been bad against tight ends for 2 consecutive seasons now. They rank last in the league in fantasy points per game over expectation. And Vernon Davis ranks 26th among all players in expected fantasy points per game over the last 3 weeks. Absolute smash spot. The only debate with Vernon Davis is, do you play him over the tight end who will all right, let's go right to it. The Giants on the other side of the ball. Are you going to play Vernon Davis over Evan Engram?
So this slate 100% entirely hinges on the health of Sterling Shepard for me. I think Shepard is in a smash spot here against Washington. You attack the Redskins across the middle of the field. Shepard, if he's healthy, he did not play Tuesday or Wednesday. I think he's in for a smash spot here, and if he were to play, it lowers the ceiling of Evan Engram. I think they're both in line for. I don't think double-digit targets for both is out of the realm of possibilities, especially with them being such massive road dogs here. But if Sterling Shepard is out, I think we can lock in Engram for 10+ targets here. The Giants will be trailing. Washington has allowed the 3rd most receptions and the most receiving yards to opposing tight ends this year. As much as we want to target the Giants and the Browns with opposing tight ends, the Redskins are right up there with them. They are not doing that well. And Engram should eat against their injury-riddled linebacking core. That's a really tough question. If you're going to try to choose between Evan Engram or Vernon Davis. And that's why I'm playing a lot of DraftKings, so I don't have to make that decision. I can play both.
I like that. Yeah, definitely going to have some lineups where I flex one of these tight ends and then play the other in the tight end position. But when you said this entire slate hinges on Sterling Shepard, I'm in complete agreement. If Shepard, we find out right now, Shepard's going to play, he's 100% healthy, I am going to have 50% exposure to Cousins, 50% exposure to Eli, and those are my 2 quarterbacks. And why I want to do that is because it's just so obvious who to play with Eli. The Redskins are a slot and tight end funnel defense. They rank 4th worst over expectation to opposing tight ends. They have the greatest disparity in fantasy production and passer rating in terms of what's allowed to outside wide receivers versus slot wide receivers. They're much more susceptible to the slot. It's why we played Adam Thielen a few weeks ago when very few others were on him. And the Giants are a slot and tight end funnel offense, so it just seems perfect. Eli is going to be without 2 starting offensive linemen, but that matchup and obvious stacking options is too much. Is too good for me. Fortunately, if we find out Sterling Shepard's not going to play, I'd pivot off of him. Makes Engram a slightly better play, though he didn't pay off last week. I don't know, Tyler. I think that's about it for my thoughts on the slate outside of the defenses.
Yeah, so I'll just mention one thing. If Shepard were to miss, I think Travis Rudolph is an interesting guy to take over those slot duties. He had 6 targets last week, and like you mentioned, the majority of targets just funnel towards the middle of the defense here. We've seen slot receivers and opposing tight ends do very well over the last 3 weeks. Doug Baldwin, 7 catches, 108 yards, and a touchdown. Thielen, as you mentioned, 8 for 166 and a score. Even Kobe Fleener came back to life with a 5 for 91. They all find ways to exploit the middle of the field against Washington with great success. At just $3K, Travis Rudolph is pretty enticing if you're looking for a punt play.
Great point, Tyler. I thought Mike Williams was my cheap wide receiver lock, but that's an excellent call as well. I'm with you. Anything else to add before we move on to defenses?
Now let's get to the defensive play. I've got a very tight core as well for the defensive position. I'm looking at the Redskins. I'm going to pay up at 3,600. Eli down to offensive lineman, like you mentioned. The Redskins do a great job of providing pressure. Ryan Kerrigan's having another great year. I'm going to be loading up with them, and I'm going to be loading up with the Chargers. Chargers are also provide fantastic pressure on the edges with Melvin Ingram and Joey Bosa. Strong trio of corners. I think those are the two defenses I'm going to be playing, Washington and the Chargers. What are you looking at, Scott?
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping that Washington Giants game shoots out, at least right now. If Shepard's out, I'll pivot more towards Washington, or if it looks like we just won't know, I'm not sure what I'll do, but I will have some exposure to the Vikings defense just because I feel they're so good, and like we talked about before, they match up really well where Detroit's strongest. But other than that, I think you nailed it on the defenses.
Yeah, so overall, I think this is a really, really interesting Thanksgiving slate. A lot of great plays at every position here. I think it's going to be really tough to try to narrow down your player pool. Hopefully Scott and I provided some suggestions here for you guys. And good luck for anyone playing this Thanksgiving slate.
All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in this week. We will have another episode for you on the weekend slate coming in a day or so. So make sure you subscribe on iTunes. Also, be kind enough to leave us a 5-star review, and you should have that episode coming to you shortly. Everyone, have a nice and wonderful Thanksgiving, and I hope you eat lots of delicious cornbread. And the games are fun to watch, and you're profitable in DFS. I'm Scott Barrett, signing off for Tyler Buecher as well. Have a good holiday, everyone. Thank you.